Welcome back. We'll start off our conversation on Sunrise Daily this morning with a look at the president's speech at the UN General Assembly, the highlights of that speech, all that he talked about. And we have joining us from New York, the Chief Executive Officer of Connected Development, joins us virtually from New York, Hamzat Lawal. Thank you for joining us, Hamzat.
Oh, thank you for having me. Good morning.
And it's good to know that you could stay up and talk to us about this. Let's start off with that. You heard the president's speech at the Chambers of the General Assembly. What's your takeaway from there?
First, I think Mr. President spoke not only on behalf of Nigeria or the sub-region, but he spoke on behalf of the continent. He spoke in solidarity of issues happening in Nigeria, in West Africa, and across the African continent. First, he talked about how we can have more shared prosperity, talking about inequality and how we can ensure that wealth actually trickles down and equally distributed from global north and global south. He talks about sustained partnership and open to doing business, but also doing business in a way that Africa benefit from that business. He talked about climate change, setting on course an ambitious climate agenda. First, he talked about broken promises around climate change, where world leaders in Paris had committed $100 billion annually to support countries like Nigeria and other African countries that around mitigation, adaptation, loss and damages and technology transfer. You know, he talks about solidarity and the case of our neighbor and other countries around the West African region where military juntas are toppling democratically elected government and, you know, expecting an olive arm from the global north to get support and working as the chairman of ECOWAS to explore diplomatic means to bring him back democratically elected government to this country. You know, he talks about prosperity and opportunities for young people. He talks about governance and why Africa is backward. And for me also, maybe to wrap up, he talked about debt burden, you know, so it's really key because if Nigeria must enjoy an economic growth, we must ensure that our partners from around the world reduce this debt burden or even eliminate this debt burden because currently we're carrying a huge debt burden as a country. And as a new administration, he's talking about how can we get debt relief so that we can then use resources generated within our country and also get support to put Nigeria on a pathway to achieving the sustainable development goals.
So it's so if in summary, one could say that the president basically was looking at from the present into the future. No need to look at the past.
Yes, definitely. And even if he's looking at the past, he's taking lessons from the past, where we cannot afford to do the same thing again, where we cannot afford to make commitments as world leaders and then break those commitments. Because the theme of the UNGA talks about, you know, public trust and also solidarity. And we know that even amongst world leaders, they don't trust themselves because over the years, over decades, they've made commitment, they've made promises, and no one have really kept to those promises. So yes, Mr. President was bold, Mr. President was courageous, and he was very specific. There was no ambiguity in his speech to world leaders in the General Assembly in New York, here in the United Nations.
Okay, Hamza, just hold on a moment there. My colleague Ayo has some assignment to carry on real quick, and then we'll come back to you on some other things that the president talked about. That question, for instance, how much of the world is ready to do business really with Nigeria and Africa? We'll be back to you shortly. Let's Ayo come in here. Ayo.
Well, interestingly, we are continuing that same conversation here with Adeni Ikuno, who is a researcher and public affairs analyst. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
I appreciate the privilege of the invitation.
Well, perhaps speaking in the same vein, Hamza started with his own takeaways from the president's speech. What are yours?
Well, I think it's important to do a general assessment of the speech. There's a tripod of assessment in political communication. The first will be the content of the speech. I give him 9 over 10. The chronological presentation, 7 over 10. Then in terms of, what intends to see from that, I definitely would think I'd give him another 8. So that's the general assessment of that. But when you talk about the specifics, if people listen to him carefully, he indicted Africa first with regards to the things that the continent has not been able to do. But he indicted the West on 3 accounts. The part one of the last of what he said was broken promises. He talked about outright exploitation. And I'm very happy that he was able to put his points across in that regard to say, quite frankly, we're aware of the issues and let's speak to it. And that, I think, is what is expected of somebody who is the leader of the regional body. You should be able to speak truth to power. And such opportunities don't come except you find yourself in the exalted offices and the powers that accompany that of a president. So I think that that is one thing that he has done. But at the same time, we need to understand that the 78th UN General Assembly, it is towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals achievement, which is very key. If you did a very careful study of the SDG goals, you must agree with me that the first talked about no hunger, the second, end poverty, the third, good health, the fourth definitely looks at qualitative education. If you come to 5, gender inequality, if you go to 10, it talks about reducing inequities. Agenda 1 to 17, nothing has about security. There's no word called security there. You have justice, you have peace. And if you look at it...
how about 16, which talks about collaboration and peace and security?
I have to say this. When you speak to issues of peace, you have to speak to issues that decisively end wars. If you look at those who trade in ammunition, the first 4, the US accounts for 40% of global trade in ammunition. Russia, about 16 or 17%. France is third in 11%, and of course China at about 5.7%. If you look at this aspect of what has actually destroyed the continent, because President Bola Ahmed Tinubu did not only speak as Nigeria's leader, he spoke on behalf of the continent of Africa. On record, over 200 coups have happened in Africa. About 83 of that have succeeded. And every of the coups we have been prosecuted by arms imported from across the Atlantic Ocean. And this is a very key discussion, because if we're talking about the quartet of what the president also mentioned, he talked about peace, he mentioned security, development, and of course he talked about development. He talked about, more or less like the economy. It must be noted here that none of the things said specifically can result in anything impactful if we don't actually look at how we can break off such things that continue to allow wars. Then I also appreciate one thing in his speech where he said, the West, you try paraphrasing him, the West should endeavor not to continue to more or less keep Africa in subterfuge, which is very key here. All of these discussions are towards letting the West understand that we have a continent that has come of age, and I appreciate the fact that he spoke from a point of view that we want to be places and peoples that you collaborate with. And I think that that particular statement he made also corroborates what William Ruto, the president of Kenya, has been saying in the past few months regarding the emergence of Africa and the need to actually have equitable partnership in progress.
Something the president also said that I think is very, very interesting, and I don't know how the world will take it, or the West will take it, when he says Africa does not wish to replace old shackles with new ones. That is, if Africa itself is not welcoming the shackles, given the kind of visits and clamor for more of Africa that we've seen in the past years.
Okay, let's look at the respective coups we've had, more or less record 5 in recent times, are always associated with different kinds of inequalities, and it is coming from the French government. If any of us understand that Chambere Kwao, the Zimbabwean American, how she was removed as, the permanent representative of the African Union, that speaks to the issues of the shackles. And I think that the incidences of repeated coups on the continent, these things are indicative of the lapses that many leaders have actually brought to the table of political leadership because they're in cahoots with the West. In France, for instance, those mining the uranium of France have children working amongst them. And if we're talking about not allowing children to be enslaved to work, which of course is one of the key areas that the United Nations is concerned about, then why does France accommodate child laborers in Oramo, in Niger Republic, and of course, people look the other way. So when you're talking about reinventing old shackles, most definitely let's understand that before the birth of the UN, obviously at the birth of it, the Marshall Plan was to actually help countries get out of the debilitation from the Second World War. And now the president is reminding them that template worked for you, because at the point they talked about the Atlantic Charter initiated by the US to enable the emancipation decisively of many African countries, the dynamics were different. The dynamics has to change. The dynamics have to change now. And for those dynamics to change, you need somebody that will remind them. And that's why the president talked about failed promises.
I wouldn't tell, I know Bukola has a question. I wouldn't even put it at the doorstep of the West as opposed to the doorstep of Africa itself, because it is African.
He accepted that at the opening. But let's say this. The instrumentalities of Africa's economic survival is designed after Western template. The Bretton Woods institution have been part of the financial strength of Africa since the end of the Second World War. By implication, what does that mean? It means that we do not have an independent formula, because let's say this, we forget that the Bretton Woods that have enabled our finances are also institutions with shareholders that want to make profit, and they have designed it in such a way that it appears as if maybe in 2050 that's what begins to get emancipated.
I'm glad you talk about emancipation. Yes, and please. You know what's happening on the West African corridor. Yes, that's please. The coups which the president also pointed to. But really, when you look at that area, you know, whether it's Mali, Burkina Faso, they are on one side, and then the other part of West Africa are on one side. So that unity that is required, you know, for Africa to present, you know, before those nations where the president is asking, look, you have to help us tackle violent extremism, is not there. So as Africa, first of all, emancipated itself from mental slavery that is required.
Well, I think that your point is very valid in this conversation. And do not forget that according to documented histories of civilization, superior civilizations have always emasculated subordinated civilizations. You'd agree with me here that if you look at the incidences of coup across the former Francophone regions of Africa, you'd agree that as much as those countries want to really free themselves, you can't do that, because even, for instance, in Niger Republic, you have about 1,500 gendarmes there in Africa. For instance, after the military personnel took over, they instructed Sylvain Ite, the ambassador of France, to leave. France had the temerity to tell them, he's not leaving, we listen to Bazoum. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu spoke on that issue regarding allowing this continent decide for itself. And I think that it is key for us to understand that many things that have affected us really are things that we should have spoken as a one against, but we still have a lot of things tied to their teters. Let us look at a situation where you have somebody tell you that all the profits you make or the monies you make must be domiciled in their central bank, and the country itself, called France, is the one that has a right of refusal if you discover any new mineral. And you find out that when such statements are made or certain pacts are signed, AU, ECOWAS, the regional body, and African Union, of course, often some don't speak to this because they feel these are independent territories. But let's look at it. The hypocrisy of the West is really beyond words. The first person that actually presided over Niger as a president was there for 14 years. One of the things that the West must do to show us that it is ready to allow Africa thrive is at the slightest observation or confirmation of a despot in power, you should do an immediate severance of your ties. But if you look at all of this, look at Gabon, for instance, father and son. France continued to deal with them. If France was willing, ditto many other Western countries, to allow Africa thrive, then at the moment somebody altered, for instance, the constitution to want to stay in power, ditto Alassane Ouattara, such things must be spoken against, and even the United Nations member countries that are truly democratic should begin to speak to us, so that we can know that for Africa, it's a democracy or nothing else.
Talking about, the hypocrisy of the West, I wonder if, that finger will not point back home as well when you consider that even outside the premises of the venue of the meeting, you find Africans protesting. You'll see that, the protesters are carrying placards against bad leadership in Africa. And I'm coming to you now, Mr. Yusuf, what exactly, is Africa doing about leadership deficit, and how will it count against, the speech of the president where he's canvassing for debt relief and, equal measure of export from Africa? That's our guest in Abuja. Mr. Hamzat, that's for you.
Oh, thank you. So, it's no secret that currently Nigeria and Africa has been exploited. If you go to the Northwest today, where we have gold reserve, people are illegally mining this gold, and they're getting support from the global North, or what we call developed economy or developed countries. And I think why Mr. President is speaking about this now is because of his agenda on national security or internal security, knowing that, Malam Nuhuribadu, who heads NSA, and his new service chief are probably working on a robust agenda around tackling illicit financial flow and illicit mining of Nigeria's vast resources, because we know some of this crisis is tied to actually the resources in these communities, and having these foreigners or elements of foreigners who are fueling the crisis that we're currently experiencing in those areas. And for debt relief, and I think Mr. President needs to set up a team, just like how President Obasanjo did at that time. And I think three allies that he should quickly reach out to. One is Madam Amina J. Mohammed, who is currently the Deputy United Nations Secretary General. The other is Madam Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is currently the Director General of World Trade Organization. And last but not the least, of course, is Dr. Akinwumi. Yes, that's Dr. Akinwumi, who's the president of the African Development Bank, AFDB. This team should spearhead his global agenda or his global campaign to get debt relief from our partners internationally, because from the impact of COVID-19 and Nigeria coming from multiple economic downtime, it's important that we take off this debt relief so that, one, we can even have a breather, because today we're experiencing multiple inflation because of the removal of coal subsidy and that ambitious removal and making the dollar or trying to regulate the FX market. So again, Mr. President needs to move fast beyond just this speech. He needs to take action by putting together a team that leads that global campaign and talking to our partners and saying, and he needs to be clear, if we get debt relief, what are we going to use our money for? I think one way Mr. President can show clearly these partners is, okay, we want to invest in quality and timely education, because we all know that early grade reading and educational output is really important. And this also put Nigeria on a pathway to economic growth, but most importantly, achieving the sustainable development goal. And also healthcare, tell world leaders, we're going to put in this investment into healthcare and building infrastructure, because the world cannot afford not to do business with Nigeria. But as Nigerians also, we need to think inward. What do we want to provide to the world beyond just natural resources? Mind you that the world is also setting zero carbon emission in 2050. So is it goods and services that would help us attract foreign exchange rates? And everyone knows that anywhere you don't see a Nigerian around the world, then that means that country is not prosperous. And so again, a leader that have come to the United Nations to share his thoughts, his perspective, and his ambitious speech to world leaders, has to now put this word into action in no distant time.
Well, Mr. Lawal, it's instructive and interesting that in your opening comments you recognized and actually highlighted the fact that the president wasn't just speaking about Nigeria, he was speaking about the West African region, he was speaking even more prominently about Africa as a continent. So when Mr. Kono was speaking the other time, he talked about the need, of course, given what the president also said, to liberate Africa. But then, even in Mr. Kono's opinions and comments, it would seem like Africa itself needs to agree that it needs to be liberated, and the collaboration among African leaders ought to begin to happen expeditiously. There are those who believe that ECOWAS and other regional bodies are more economic than political, while AU itself is more political than economic. So help us understand how you think this collaboration can happen so that Africa can become a strong continent like the EU.
I think first is for us to even reflect. And as we reflect, we need to take stock. What have we achieved as ECOWAS? What have we achieved as African Union? And we need to tell ourselves the truth. Within the South region as ECOWAS, we don't even have an identity, an economic identity, in the sense that there is no legal tender that is acceptable across even the West African region, let alone the African region. Now let's look at the impediments of even immigration or migration. Like, within the continent, there are countries in Africa that we cannot freely travel to or even transport goods and services to within our own sub-region within the continent. Yes, we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Zone, but how have we operationalized it? And what are the gains and benefits of it? And I think as a continent, we need to reflect and tell ourselves the truth. Because if we really want to become a bloc that is respected, a bloc that attracts foreign direct investments, but most importantly, a bloc that is powerful in the negotiation of parties within the United Nations framework, we need to agree that we must become economically viable. We must do business within ourselves and even agree on a legal tender that is acceptable within the African region. EU did not just wake up and became this very strong. And I think to our partners around the world, because Mr. President was clear about post the Second World War, a framework was set together to support EU and other war-torn zone. Why are we not building a park? Why are we not building a park that Nigeria, that the African region can benefit from? A park that entrenches the dividends of democracy and allow people to build on the gains of democracy in some countries, roll back on the negative impact of the intervention of the military junta, and ensure that, as a continent, we can then seek economic and political prosperity. You cannot take politics out of it. You need find politics, find politics, find public policy. That's what you're going to refine together and get good governance within this continent.
Well, strong points that have been made there. Well, I believe that Nyota, my colleague in Abuja, has questions for either you or Mr. Kono here in the studio. Nyota?
Yeah, I do have questions for Lawa and Mr. Kun, but let me start off with Lawa. That matter, you were talking earlier about learning from the past and looking into the future. If we're going to look at the lessons learned, the president talking about the future and where Africa and Nigeria needs to get to, one would say that it doesn't appear that Nigerians, citizens, and even Africans have learned any lessons whatsoever, maybe based on the examples that they've seen from their leaders. How would that change?
I think first, we're currently experiencing an identity crisis, because if you want to learn, you must actually, take out the veil. Today, my generation, because I belong to a very young generation that is energetic, my generation is dealing with the Japa syndrome. There's that there's that hostility in integration and inclusion. So the fact that Mr. President is now recognizing, and the fact that we need to take stock from those lessons is to have very difficult conversation as a country and as a people. Because if we say we're truly a nation, we need to have those difficult conversations. People need to heal. And I think we need to even go back to our own crisis, which is the civil war. We need to talk about the civil war. What are the gains? What are the negative effects? And how can we build and recover from those kind of civil war? Then we need to also talk about, our budget. And when I say our budget, we need to talk about the leakages in this budget, because the leadership of a country is a reflection of the people. But again, the leadership of the country must take bold steps, must lead by example. We cannot say that we're dealing with the dwindling economy and we're not cutting cost of governance. Again, how are we integrating people with disability? How are we ensuring gender inclusion? How are we building a society where women are protected, where women are seen as equal partners and plays a leadership role in our politics, in our governance and public policy? And how do we put young people in the center of this? Because we're dealing with a population demography of over 60% of our population. This is over 100 million people. How are we putting them in the center? Because I like how Mr. President said, the problem is not Africa. And I'm saying now that the problem are not young people. You need to see young people as your partner towards progress. Because if you have, this perception about young people as a problem, then they would continue to become a problem. But when you see them as partners towards prosperity, and then they would support your government, because you need public support for whatever policy or agenda that must take shape. And tie this into internal security.
Hamzat, we'll just, if I may interrupt you here briefly, we need to go on a very quick break. We'll come back and pick up that matter of conversations. We'll pick it up. Mr. Okunu will have to weigh in on this. The conversation of identity and what we want to do with our identity. We'll be back in a moment. Please don't go away. And thank you for staying with us. We'll continue our conversation this morning on the President's speech at the UN General Assembly. From our Lagos studio, we have Adeni Okunu, public affairs analyst and researcher, and joining us virtually from New York, Hamzat Lawal, CEO, Connected Development. Mr. Okunu, let me bring this to you. I mean, Hamzat talked about the fact that we, Nigeria, and indeed Africans, need to go back and revisit some of the things that we many times love to bury. For instance, the civil war conversation in Nigeria, the question of identity as a nation and as a people. What's your take? Because he feels that unless that is done, all this highlights or the high points of the president's conversation about moving Africa and Nigeria forward may never happen.
Let me tell you that the homogeneity of Europe is actually something we don't find here. And until we understand that there are dynamics of togetherness, we'll continue to negotiate our supposed corporate future and existence disparately. The Arab League has about over 22 countries, and the entire North African countries are actually part of the Arab League. As a matter of fact, according to documented history, at some point, Morocco had actually, written to be part of Europe. That is identity crisis. A country on the continent of Africa negotiating to belong in another continent, whereas its geography is within Africa. That is one part. In 2019, the ECOWAS body wanted to do something regarding the currency issue that Hamza talked about. That was supposed to be the eco currency. They had a meeting here in Nigeria in Abuja, and after that meeting, they were supposed to launch the eco currency in 2020. At about that period, what France did was France went to Côte d'Ivoire and actually manipulated the same Côte d'Ivoire not to be part of the countries that will actually help ensure that the region has eco currency, because its currency is domiciled in France. Of course, they use the francs. I'm simply saying this, that until Africa realizes that these cracks in its walls must be carefully looked at, and that it speaks to issues as a unit. Let's look at Equatorial Guinea. The leader of Equatorial Guinea has been there since the 70s. Between that time, Nigeria has had maybe 6, 7 leaders, but one person is there. And African Union has not deemed it fit, for instance, to expel Equatorial Guinea
saying that one person cannot be there. The same African Union didn't even feel to expel the Bongo family because of the Sithitism. So if we're talking about identity as a people, it has to come to the point where every regional or continental body sits down and says, this is what we want even from us. Because anybody who comes to your house and sees your house in disarray takes advantage. But if anybody comes to the continent and finds out that the continent is organized and not accommodating disparate ideologies or tendencies that are negative, then it negotiates with you underground. Excuse me, I buy products made from China in the US, but I don't get the same quality of the same product in Nigeria because China finds out that in Nigeria, substandard goods can be looked away from, but it cannot try that with the United States government. It simply means Africa must tell the world that there are certain things it doesn't accommodate, or else we'll throw those people that are not willing to collaborate out. That is something that will help. Then we must also speak to the issue of slavery in Africa. The president talked about the commodification of human beings, men, women, and children. How can we be on the continent of Africa together, and Libya and many other countries in North Africa are trading in fellow human beings from Africa? And most of the people being traded are those that have the color of my skin, not fellow Arabs. In fact, about 120 years ago, the Arabs have a culture of selling, I need to say here, people that are from this side of Africa that have the color of my skin. As a matter of fact, the first set of people that were caught around Mauritania. They took them to Portugal, and they came back advising Portuguese explorers that there are more people for them to catch as slaves, and they came here. And that culture is domiciled within the Arab culture, for those who understand history. So our identity is already atrophied by these negativities that many people in Africa look away from. Are we saying that those who trade in persons are not known? The same way we claim that most of the people that are agents of insurgencies and divisions and non-state actors here are not known. I think that Africa must come to terms with its failures and be ready to deal with these negativities and stand itself that, don't forget, the SDG goal, the first one, end hunger. The second, end poverty. How can you end poverty and how can you terminate hunger if, quite frankly, even within respective African countries, the leadership of those countries are not giving the dividends of democracy to their citizens? So when they meet at the African Union, they should be able to sit there and say, you have been there for 30 years. Look at Togo closest to us. A father left office and ECOWAS kept their eyes closed. The son took over. Identity problem, because identity is also about the strength and impression you create. Identity is about how you make people see you. Identity is also your readiness to provide solutions to issues.
If I may come in, Mr. Okunu, there is this matter, you've been talking about Africa,
yes,
but the question was also tied down to, around Nigeria as well. This matter of identity in Nigeria,
yes,
the division, the fault lines amongst Nigerians, and how that cannot even help this conversation in any way unless we are able to look at how can we break down the walls that seem to divide us. That's the word.
Okay, thank you very much. If you check the constitution of this country, Section 10 tells us, one of the shortest portions of the constitution, there shall not be state-sponsored religion. In complete disregard to that portion of the constitution, the North decided to choose Sharia law against what the constitution of the country has, and there have been successive leadership from President Olusegun Obasanjo when he was in office that didn't say this is a complete violation of the secularist nature of what we operate in this country. That's one. The same people that are operating Sharia law, don't forget, are collecting taxes from alcohol sold. An aberration. Nobody is able to think about a solution that you cannot be operating Sharia law that forbids alcohol, but you're collecting taxes from that. That's a problem. So now let's look at the country and the people that are there, especially Nigeria. What is it called? Croatia has about 4 million people. They speak the same language. The reality is, as much as we believe that staying together is advantageous, I think that the conversation about our togetherness must be had. Since the Civil War of 1967 to 1970, the people from the Southeast got 20 pounds for all the property they had. And there have been complete discussions about addressing issues of people feeling that they don't belong to this country because of how they are treated, I think that nobody should be afraid to have conversations. And I think that Live has provided the current president with this opportunity to say, okay, these cracks in the wall, don't forget, apart from ethnic division that is affecting our development, you also have the aspect of poverty division. The rich belong to a clique. For instance, the average earners belong to a clique. Those who are poor and downtrodden belong to a clique. And we oftentimes forget that there are more numbers of those that are poor and don't have opportunities at the lower rung, but they are more in number. And that is why you have non-state actors in cahoots with some people that are privileged and that perhaps may not be happy with certain things in the system, continue to disrupt it. So the first thing we must do as a country is be ready to have conversations about our corporate existence. By ancestry, I'm Yoruba. By ancestry, not your perhaps maybe South. There's a commonality in ideology amongst those within the western part of this country, the southern part of this country, particularly southwest, southeast, south, religious-wise, education-wise, ideology-wise, and we speak to issues despite our religion. But I served in the north after my university education, and I know that the ideology of the region of the north is quite different when it comes to certain issues.
So the question then would be how that will be addressed. Now, how do we reverse that trend?
The first thing is to have the conversation. In terms of our ethnic orientation, religious affiliation, these are our views. And because those views, for instance, don't accommodate, accept, okay, I talked about alcohol and taxes.
Sorry.
But Mr. Kuno, we've had that conversation over and over again, endlessly, series of documents, you know, for which have not been implemented over the years. So it looks like we're taking 2 steps forward and 1 step forward, 2 steps back.
It would have been disadvantageous if these conversations don't continue. And I want to thank God and faith for Channels Television as a key media platform, raising the bar of speaking to these issues. Now, any society where people don't engage on issues, as a matter of fact, researchers in auditory science have said that you need to say something about it 1,000 times for it to stick. So perhaps we are just on our 500th discussion on this.
In 63 years.
Oh, I'm simply saying that. Yes.
Well, speak to some of the things that... Yes, because this is all around the conversation.
They're all connected.
That's true.
The president raised, you know. And, you know, one thing that Neta asked you, which Hamza also spoke to, is the need for that collaboration, that unity among African leaders.
It is possible.
Now, if that is not happening within each country, how can it happen at the continental level?
I'm very happy that the president, again, has taken the opportunity to speak to these issues. And I'm also happy they were corroborating the need for that conversation by this televised program. It's a consolidation of ideas that become an outburst of solutions. And in civilized climes such as ours, conversations lead oftentimes to solutions. I think that those who are listening for the president also understand at this juncture that we are raising issues of speaking to the divisions that are obvious, first in our country, across the region, and of course on the continent. Don't forget, I have re-emphasized here this morning that ECOWAS needs to actually readdress how we considered those that are sit-tight leaders in their country and say, we will immediately expel you. If you are not able to conduct elections over 2 terms, maybe 5 years, maybe 4, immediately the entire body stands against you. I think if every leader understands that, then that will happen. That's number 1. Number 2, poverty is endemic on this continent. And it is quite antithetical to the abundant resources we have here. And I think that for every leadership across this continent is to come clean and be ready to show the peoples that we are transparent enough to let you understand that we have these resources and we're able to provide solutions. Hamza talked about not just providing resources or not just providing raw materials or natural resources. We must also learn to understand the need to explore the entire value chain of what we have. If we check the continent of Africa, we don't trade with one another up to 30–40%. But even within the US or Britain, the trade amongst those people is even more than some of the things they get from here. It means we also must consider intracontinental trade so that we can actually be strong. So we're talking ensuring that poverty ends, ensuring that there's food on the table. But of course, we also have to bring into this discussion social welfare. But you cannot do that without data. The president told the governors, give me data on those that need to be given assistance. We've not seen data, but rice has gone out. We've not seen data, 2 billion has gone out. How do you address this issue without data? We've not had election in over 10 years, and it's supposed to be every 10 years.
In the absence of, the common identity, eco-currency, accountability and leadership, which are key issues that we need in Africa, the president also talked about something significant when he recalled history, that gave rise to the Bretton Woods institutions and the United Nations that rose to the occasion for Europe with the Marshall Plan. He's saying we're not asking for the same, level of programs, but we're asking for political commitment. So how do we approach that in the absence of all these key factors that we require?
We have to look at the mirror. The Nigerian community is the one that provides, for instance, a individual. There's a Wale Adebayo, the one who was actually with the United Trade Bureau. Only recently, Adeni Ikunu sitting here was among 3 Africans that provide recommendations for the United States Trade Bureau, just to be able to know how we trade with that. Only me, Nigerian, amongst maybe 2 others, the rest are from the West. Why? It means that we have enough to give to the West in terms of knowledge, in terms of direction, in terms of know-how. It means, therefore, that this country and Africa must begin to harness its resources so that oftentimes it can negotiate on its strength and not on its weaknesses.
And then the biggest resource that Africa has is certainly its people. We could continue this conversation, Mr. Okono, but we are completely out of time.
I really appreciate the privilege of coming.
Adeni Okono is a researcher and public affairs analyst. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
But Nyata, you were speaking to Hamza the other time, and he mentioned something about young people. I'm wondering how we'll be able to fully engage African youths long term to ensure that whatever gains we have today, we don't lose without properly engaging them. Nyata.
Yeah, Hamza, you heard that question from Ayo. How are we going to engage African youth so that the gains that have been gotten are not lost?
Well, first, we need to invest in history. You see, it's really sad and unfortunate that at one point there was a conversation about military rule in Nigeria's in uninterrupted democracy for the past 20 years. We need to invest heavily on history so that we can get a knowledge and historic bank within our country, and also learn from other African countries like Rwanda, where, ethnicity, religion, and even military play a role that has continued to impact them negatively. I must commend President Bola Ahmed Tinubu. He has just appointed a Minister of Youth that is actually young. This is unprecedented. And I see that he has also appointed advisors and aides that are relatively very young with experience, capacity, and knowledge. And I think this is how you extend an olive branch to that demography. We need to continue to see more young people integrate into government and have that shift. But also, how do we plan for the future of Nigeria? Is to invest in education, and continue to invest in education, because if you look at the future of this country currently, and to be honest, it's blink. It's blink in the sense that when you go to grassroots communities, particularly public school, I'm a product and a very proud product of public school. But when you look at various public institutions, and this is also tied to the theme of the theme of the United Nations General Assembly, rebuilding back public trust. We can only use public institutions to rebuild trust. We need to invest in our education, in our public institution. And maybe to wrap up my thought is to bring Nigerian police in the center of this. You see, what we have is the Nigerian police force. I think we need to change the name to the Nigerian Police Service. I say this because, everything is about perception, and the name that one's bear inspires the kind of perception that the people see them as. I know President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is committed to strengthen public institutions, but Nigerian police force is key and is central to all of this, because this in most grassroots communities, what they see as a sense of government or governance is a Nigerian police. There is no place in this country where you don't have a Nigerian police outpost. So it is key that one, their remuneration is reviewed upward. We provide them with resources for training, for equipment, and we safeguard them. We cannot afford to continue to lose the lives of Nigerian police. Citizens in Nigeria must protect the institution that makes you and I go to bed and close our two eyes and have good sleep. They've sacrificed a lot. And I think that we cannot continue to throw blames around. We must internalize this. We must look at society as a whole, and not just
Hamzat,
if
I may come in here, we're almost out of time. But there's this matter of the Nigeria police retool, protect the institutions that helps us go to sleep, retooling and re-equipping, review their welfare package. There are those who would argue that it would be a lot of work because it will require a mindset retooling. That means retraining the entire police force, and not just about equipment, using equipment and all that, but mindset. It will require recruitment of new people with a different training curriculum, and this would take a long while. What do you advise should be done?
So first, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu said, I asked for the job and I'm up to the task. That being said, you see, we have one of the finest Nigerian police officers. When you engage the Nigerian police officer in their various offices, who are investigators, who are intelligence officer. And then when you also engage the ones you see mountain patrol or checkpoint, there's that big gap, in terms of capacity and knowledge. Yes, we need to provide some level of training, but we also need to show that we have what it takes. And we have some very fine police officers who are making Nigeria proud and who are even getting international recognition. I don't think this is rocket science. I think that if there is a will, there is a way. And what we need is the political will and that commitment from Mr. President and from our service chiefs. And you see, Mr. President has sent a signal, that he's particularly interested in ensuring that Nigerian police take over internal security. And that's why we have someone like Malam Norubadu as the NSC, with vast knowledge and experience on anti-corruption, but also intelligence gathering from the Nigerian police. So again, I think it's the will, I think it's that commitment, and setting a timeline for us to look at how are we going to achieve this together as civil society, as government, as private institution, but most importantly, as Nigerian people.
Thank you very much, Hamzat Lawal, CEO, Connected Development. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure you can't wait to get to bed right now. Thank you so much. So, as I leave back in a moment.
Well, thank you.